The Vietnam War was a prolonged conflict that took place from 1955 to 1975. It was fought between the Communist government of North Vietnam, supported by its Communist allies, and the government of South Vietnam, supported by the United States and other anti-communist nations. The war also involved neighboring countries like Laos and Cambodia. The conflict began as a result of the division of Vietnam after the defeat of the French colonialists in 1954. The North aimed to unify the country under a communist regime, while the South aimed to maintain a non-communist government. The United States became increasingly involved in the war during the 1960s, deploying troops and conducting intensive bombing campaigns against North Vietnam. Despite the superior military power of the U.S. and its allies, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong guerrillas resisted fiercely. The war was highly controversial, both domestically within the United States and internationally. It led to widespread protests and anti-war movements. In 1973, the U.S. withdrew its troops following the Paris Peace Accords, but fighting continued, leading to the fall of Saigon and the unification of Vietnam under communist rule in 1975. The Vietnam War, spanning from 1955 to 1975, was one of the most significant and controversial military conflicts of the 20th century. This article provides an in-depth overview of the war, its origins, major events, and lasting impacts. The roots of the Vietnam War can be traced back to the end of World War II, when Vietnam, which had been a French colony since the late 19th century, sought independence from French colonial rule. A communist-led nationalist movement, known as the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, declared Vietnam's independence in 1945. However, the French sought to regain control of their colony, leading to the First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954. The conflict culminated in the defeat of the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The subsequent Geneva Accords divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel into communist-controlled North Vietnam and non-communist South Vietnam. Following the division of Vietnam, the United States became increasingly involved in an effort to contain the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, in line with its Cold War policy of containment. The U.S. provided financial and military assistance to the South Vietnamese government and began sending military advisors to train the South Vietnamese army. In 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where North Vietnamese boats allegedly attacked U.S. naval vessels, prompted Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving President Lyndon B. Johnson the authority to use military force in Vietnam. This marked the beginning of full-scale U.S. involvement in the conflict. The U.S. adopted a strategy of gradual escalation, involving the deployment of ground troops, intensive bombing campaigns, and the widespread use of chemical defoliants like Agent Orange to destroy the jungle cover used by the Viet Cong guerrillas. In 1968, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched a massive offensive during the Lunar New Year holiday, known as the Tet Offensive. Although the offensive was militarily unsuccessful for the North, it had a profound psychological impact in the United States, undermining public support for the war. President Richard Nixon, elected in 1968, implemented a policy of Vietnamization, aimed at transferring the responsibility for the war back to the South Vietnamese government while gradually withdrawing U.S. troops. Additionally, peace talks began in Paris in 1968, leading to the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, which called for a ceasefire and U.S. troop withdrawal. Despite the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, fighting continued between North and South Vietnam. In 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a major offensive, leading to the fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975, and the unification of Vietnam under communist rule. The war resulted in millions of casualties, including Vietnamese civilians and military personnel, as well as thousands of American soldiers. Entire villages were destroyed, and the countryside was littered with unexploded ordnance. In the United States, the war led to a deep divide in public opinion, sparking widespread protests and anti-war movements. The war also exposed the limitations of American military power and led to a re-evaluation of U.S. foreign policy. In Vietnam, the war left a legacy of economic devastation and environmental damage due to the widespread use of chemical defoliants. The country faced challenges in post-war reconstruction and reconciliation. The Vietnam War was a complex and multifaceted conflict with deep historical roots and far-reaching consequences. It was shaped by Cold War geopolitics, nationalism, and ideological differences. The war's impact was felt not only in Vietnam but also in the United States and around the world, leaving a legacy of division, trauma, and reflection on the limits of military intervention.